Some people just seem to be born for a life of crime. This guy, he literally had it in his blood. It wasn't until the U.S. government systematically wiped out his entire family that he finally decided to hang up his guns. But before that, he was a force to be reckoned with. And even today, over a century after his death, his name is synonymous with the word badass. He is, of course, none other than Geronimo. So let's talk about this guy and find out how he went from being a simple sheep herder to one of the most wanted men in the American West. Geronimo was born in 1829 in what is today southern Arizona. His birth name was Goyahkla, which means the one who yawns, in English. Now, his father was an Apache, but his mother was a Spanish Mexican, which made him half white. And back then, having white blood didn't really help you out in the least. As a matter of fact, it probably made things worse. See, at the time, the only whites that Apaches had any contact with were either the conquistadors or the Spanish missionaries that followed them. And both groups were only interested in one thing: converting them to Christianity or killing them. In fact, when Geronimo was still just a little baby, his father and two of his uncles were killed by Mexican soldiers. So basically, right off the bat, Geronimo's whole life was a series of fleeing soldiers and living in hiding, all while constantly on the brink of starvation. The nomadic life of the Apaches was rough. They traveled endlessly through the rugged terrain of the Southwest desert, fighting not only for their survival against the elements, but also against other tribes trying to steal their limited resources. Geronimo would join his tribe's war parties, scalping anyone who got in their way. By the age of 16, he already had several scalps under his belt. Then when he was around 20 years old, he did something every young guy dreams of doing. He killed a mountain lion with his bare hands. It was during this time that Geronimo developed his ferocious reputation as a fighter, though he was never just a mindless brawler. You see, to Geronimo, strategy was just as important as brute strength. This will become very apparent later on when we look at some of his more famous battles. But for now, we have to fast forward a few years into the late 1860s. By this time, Geronimo has married and started a family of his own. But sadly, like so many Native Americans at the time, he is starting to see his people fall victim to an incurable disease brought over by European settlers: smallpox. In less than 2 decades, this highly contagious virus would kill over half of the indigenous population in the United States. In the summer of 1871, a smallpox epidemic struck Geronimo's tribe hard. Within just 3 months, 65 of his relatives would die, including his wife and 3 of his children. So what was this poor guy supposed to do? Take up sheep herding, move to the city, get a 9-to-5 job? Of course not. Instead, Geronimo did what any rational person would do when they are grieving the loss of their entire family. They go on a murder spree. And boy, did he go on a spree. Geronimo led a small group of warriors on a campaign of terror across southern Arizona and New Mexico. In the span of just 2 years, he and his group would kill hundreds of Mexicans and American settlers. At first, he was mainly targeting Mexican soldiers and civilians because he held them responsible for bringing the disease to his people. But as time went on, he became less discriminate and started killing just about anyone. His brutality was matched only by his cunning. One night, he and his group ambushed a stagecoach carrying U.S. soldiers. But instead of immediately attacking the passengers, Geronimo waited until dawn. When the sun came up, he and his men pretended to surrender. Thinking they were outnumbered and outgunned, the soldiers lowered their weapons. But as soon as they did, Geronimo opened fire, killing 4 soldiers and sending the rest running for their lives. A few weeks later, he repeated the same trick on another group of soldiers. This time, he pretended to surrender, then opened fire on the unsuspecting soldiers, killing 6 of them. Of course, whenever anything bad happened in the frontier town, everyone blamed Apaches, and the local militias would always come looking for revenge. But they were never able to catch Geronimo. He was simply too good. He knew the desert like the back of his hand. He could go days without water, and if he ever got tired of running, He could always just hop on a horse and disappear into the horizon. For over a decade, Geronimo managed to elude his pursuers, but eventually the U.S. government put a bounty on his head and paid anyone who brought him dead or alive. Eventually, the relentless pressure from the U.S. Army forced Geronimo and his group to flee into Mexico. There, they lived in relative peace for a few years, though they did occasionally cross back into the United States to raid settlements. But as the years passed, Geronimo began to tire of the violence. He lost faith in his people and believed that it was his duty to protect the settlers from his fellow Apaches. Then, in 1886, he and his group surrendered to General Nelson Miles. Everyone assumed that Geronimo had come to his senses and decided to live a peaceful life on a reservation. But this couldn't have been further from the truth. Geronimo hated the U.S. Army. He hated the settlers, and he absolutely hated the government. He was willing to surrender, but only so he could heal and regroup, planning to launch one final attack against the American government. Unfortunately for him, his fellow Apaches weren't nearly as ambitious as he was. They liked the reservation life a little too much. Geronimo spent the next 2 years organizing a new war party, training his warriors and watching his enemies grow complacent. Then in 1888, he launched his final attack. He and his group ambushed a supply train carrying food to the San Carlos Apache Reservation. After killing everyone on board, Geronimo gathered the supplies and set off deeper into the desert. He planned to hole up in the remote Sierra Madre Mountains and wage a guerrilla war against the U.S. Army. The plan was to use hit-and-run tactics to weaken the army, then emerge victorious once they were depleted. But unfortunately, Geronimo had misjudged his enemy. The army sent after him were not the bumbling fools he was used to. They were led by a brilliant general named General Crook. Crook knew the best way to fight Geronimo was not with brute force, but with intelligence. He tracked Geronimo's every move and predicted where he would strike next. Then he would send his troops and intercept him. Geronimo managed to escape time and time again, but it was clear to him that he was being hunted by a professional. Plus, his supplies were starting to dwindle. Geronimo had miscalculated, and there wasn't enough food in the mountains to sustain him and his men. By the end of November, he and his group were starving. He had no choice but to surrender. On November 4th, 1886, he met with General Crook and laid down his weapons. But Geronimo never gave up his beliefs. Even in captivity, he continued to protest the U.S. government and refused to accept their treaty. But after spending 34 years evading the authorities, it seemed like Geronimo was finally ready to give up. After surrendering, Geronimo was imprisoned in a Florida jail for 2 years. Then he was transferred to a prison in Kansas. Throughout his incarceration, he never stopped fighting for the rights of Native Americans. He lobbied President Teddy Roosevelt to reinstate the treaties that had been violated, and he argued for better treatment of prisoners on reservations. But his efforts fell on deaf ears. After serving 8 years in prison, Geronimo was released. He moved to Oklahoma and tried to start a new life as a farmer. But he never forgot his Apache roots. Whenever he saw a white man, he would remember all those years of pain and suffering and always remain wary. He lived out the rest of his days on a small farm, telling stories about his exploits and passing down Apache culture to the younger generation. He died on February 17, 1909, at the age of 79. Even though he had surrendered, Geronimo never forgot his Apache roots. Now check out Crazy Horse, the Lakota warrior who never surrendered, or click this other video instead.